This is chapter 1, the last chapter we have on ecology. This is on conservation and biodiversity. In this picture we can see some habitat destruction through deforestation. This is especially prominent in the tropical rainforest, as seen here in the Amazon rainforest of Brazil. It's a major cause of the current decline in biodiversity. It's estimated the current rate of species extinction is 500 to 1,000 times the rate seen previously when there was no unusual geological or climatic events to cause a lot of species extinction. The majority of extinctions will be species science has yet to describe. There's many in the tropical rainforest like the Amazon, and this can seem kind of like a strange idea, but when you consider there is a lot of species that we cannot see with the naked eye, and when we do look at them underneath the microscope, they may stain and have appearances that are very similar. When we look into microbiology, there are several bacteria that are all rod-shaped, and so we don't necessarily know we are looking at different species. There is a lot of species we haven't identified that are potentially dying off that we just have no idea about. So here we have a tropical lowland rainforest in Madagascar. It's an example of a high biodiversity habitat. This particular location is protected within a national forest, but only 10% of the original coastal lowland forest remains. And research suggests half the original biodiversity has been lost. So biodiversity is the biological variety. It takes into account both the number of species and the number of individuals in each of those species. When you lose biodiversity, it's likely to impact humans through collapse of ecosystem, added costs to food production, clean air and water, and human health. Our whole ecosystem really is a fairly delicate balance that when you throw something off, it's going to impact everything else around it. So the variety of ecosystems we have on Earth, from coral reefs to prairie, enables a great diversity of species to exist. So when we talk about types of biodiversity, it generally means the number of species on Earth. When you have genetic diversity, this is raw material for adaptation in species. So potential genes that are out there for future potential adaptation or evolution. With chemical diversity, you have species with the different genetic makeups are going to produce different assortments of chemicals in their cells. It's cheaper to discover compounds that are made by an organism than to imagine them and try and create them in the lab. So a lot of what is used in medicine and technology is actually chemicals that have been created by other organisms. With ecosystem diversity, this is the number of ecosystems on Earth. Loss of an ecosystem means loss of the interaction between the species, the unique features of co-adaptation, and the biological productivity in that area. So current species diversity, the knowledge of species that inhabit the planet is limited. We have names for about 1.5 million eukaryotes, and it's estimated that that accounts for less than 20% of the total number of eukaryotic species. When something has been made extinct, the species is removed from Earth. So in this map, it's going to illustrate the number of amphibian species across the globe, and you can see higher biodiversity at the lower latitude, so when you get close to the equator. Similar pattern is observed for most taxonomic groups. So if you were to look at mammals, insects, anything, you'll see a similar pattern. So an endemic species is one that's found only in one location. Biodiversity increases as you get closer to the equator. And your habitat heterogeneity is the number of ecological niches in the area. So why is biodiversity important? Being that we are humans, we tend to look at things in a little bit more of a human-centered way. So human health. Medications, we use a lot of different things in the environment as medications. Many plants produce secondary plant compounds that are toxins to protect the plant. Some will work as medicines. Some examples: aspirin, that comes from willow, from the white willow bark; codeine, digoxin from the foxglove plant; vincristine, many antibiotics. Most of you are probably consuming some today. Caffeine. Recent research in animal venoms and poisons are looking at those as having uses for medicines as well. So this is the Madagascar periwinkle that's got various medicinal properties. It's the source of the vincristine drug that's used to treat lymphomas. Agriculture. So potato blight has wiped out crops. We have the increased risk of disease. With honeybees, the colony collapse disorder, without the bees, it's going to be very difficult to get adequate pollination. Humans compete with crop pests for food. So one of the things, we do have several crops that originally had lots of different variety. We only grow a few varieties of corn. We only grow a few varieties of bananas, when those originally existed in multiple different varieties. Since 1920s, the government agriculture departments have maintained a seed bank. And so this is to try and have a backup plan in case we lose too much of the biodiversity, but accidents can still cause seed banks to be lost. It's a nice idea, but it's not a guarantee. So this is a global seed vault storage facility here. So it's very limited access to this, so that we can try and make sure those different types of seeds are protected. Another importance is for wild food sources, primarily fish. Aquatic resources are the main source of animal proteins for about 1 billion people. Things that threaten biodiversity: habitat loss, overharvesting, exotic species, which we will talk more about later. The fourth is climate change, that's predicted to become more significant in the future. Here you can see an example of fluctuating carbon dioxide levels, that they have fluctuated in a cyclical manner. However, what's different now is we burn fossil fuels, and that's caused a dramatic increase in the levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. So they're now at levels that have never been seen before on Earth. So humans have technology to modify the environment to replace functions that were once formed by the ecosystems. So we can try and do things to help ourselves a little bit more, but other species do not have this option, so they are more likely to die off. Elimination of habitat often kills the species that live in it. And this is not just in forests, but also in rivers and streams. 97% of the streams in the United States are modified by dams. Overharvesting, this is particularly threatening to aquatic species. So many countries are going to regulate fisheries as a result. Something called the tragedy of the commons is you've got common resources available to anyone willing to fish it. Even if it lies within a country's territorial waters, there's little motivation to exercise restraint when they don't own the fishery. With coral reefs, these are home to 1/3 of the marine fish, about 4,000 species. Many of the tropical fish in aquariums are actually wild caught, not cultured, so that's taking away from some of our coral reef fish. Bushmeat, this is a generic term for wild animals killed for food. Some of the hunting practices in equatorial Africa and parts of Asia are believed to threaten several species with extinction. This is an example of an oil palm plantation in Borneo, and this replaces native forest habitat that a variety of species depend on to live. So the exotic species, these are species that are intentionally or unintentionally introduced by humans into an ecosystem in which they did not evolve, so they would not normally be there. This has been increased with human transportation of people and goods. Most introductions probably fail, but some have characteristics that allow them to thrive and have dramatic population explosions. So they can reset the ecology and threaten species that are already there and become invasive. Lakes and islands are particularly vulnerable. So with air travel, you do try to minimize the number of animals or reptiles or insects that hitchhike rides on commercial flights, but they do get away with it at times and can potentially end up places in lakes. You can have boats that will travel between different bodies of water that can carry different types of algae into different lakes. You also have people that will have pets that they decide they no longer want them, that are exotic pets, and release them into the wild. So many aquatic introductions occur when ships dump their ballast water from a port of origin into a destination port. You can have disease-causing organisms that will infect native species. Sometimes they were intentionally brought in. The cane toads in Australia were brought in trying to eliminate another pest. Ended up they didn't want the pest, but they were able to breed prolifically in Australia, and they are spreading out throughout the country. They now are doing, they have things set up so that anyone who catches cane toads, they give people bags to put them in. They will come and pick them up. They're poisonous to your pets. So they want to collect as many of these cane toads and have as many of them killed as possible because they're destroying other things. Brown tree snake here. This is an exotic species that's caused numerous extinctions on the island of Guam since it was accidentally introduced in 1950. This is the Lamosa harlequin frog. It's an endangered species from Panama. It died from a fungal disease, and the red lesions are symptomatic of the disease. So that's a case where a fungus was introduced that the organisms there weren't able to tolerate, and it killed off other organisms. This is a little brown bat in Greeley Mine, Vermont, and it was found to have white nose syndrome. So climate change, this is a major extinction threat, especially when it's combined with habitat loss. So when you have climate shifts, it will cause the species to move, and now you can have new competitive regimes. So they may have new competition when they move to their new home. Others who lived in a place that got invaded will now have new competition as well. So you can see unexpected matings. Polar and grizzly bears have mated to produce viable offspring growler bears, which they wouldn't normally be in the same area. The climate gradient can move up mountains, and it will cause crowding of species, and some will disappear. You can have ocean levels rise, and it will reduce land size. It can even eliminate some countries. So here is showing a continuing retreat of the Grinnell Glacier. This is in Glacier National Park, and so you can see where the glacier was in 1938 compared to 2009, how the glacier is retreating. You can even see a difference if you've lived in this area for a long time of the change in the glaciers on Mount Rainier in the summer months. So there have been changes in biodiversity throughout time. It's an equilibrium of two evolutionary processes, speciation and extinction. Both are normal parts of macroevolution and have fluctuated in the fossil record. So there have been times where we've seen mass extinctions where you have the rate of extinction going much faster than the rate of speciation. So here you can see extinction intensity increases as reflected in the fossil record. So you can have these peaks that will come in, and you will have extinctions. So when you just have a sudden and dramatic loss of biodiversity, it's called a mass extinction, and this has occurred 5 times that we can tell on fossil records. So the 6th mass extinction, or the Holocene, has mostly to do with activities of humans. So that is what they figure will be the next mass extinction. We have coincident extinctions with the expansion of European colonies since the 1500s. So as humans have started to move around, we have seen more extinctions come along with our presence. Here's an example, the dodo bird. It was hunted to extinction around 1662. There are other species that have been hunted to extinction. Another example that I don't have a picture of in the note is the Tasmanian tiger. That was hunted to extinction, and you can actually, if you're interested, search for the last video clip that they have of one named Benjamin that died in captivity. So it's hard to estimate present-day extinction rates, since most extinctions are probably happening without being observed. You can have extinctions of microorganisms that you can't see with the naked eye. Your background extinction rate is estimated at 1 per million species years. So that's what the E/MSY is 1 species year is 1 species in existence for 1 year. So one contemporary estimate for birds alone is 26. And the species area relationship is the rate at which new species are seen when the surveyed area is increased. It correlates the species with habitat loss. So species area estimates have led to estimated rates of 1,000 times the rate in present day, but our actual observations do not show this. So it will probably take some time for the effects of habitat loss to show. So this may also overestimate. So here's a typical species area curve that shows the cumulative number of species found as more and more area sampled. So the curve has also been interpreted to show the effect on species numbers of destroying habitat, a reduction in habitat from 90%, and the reduced number of species that are supported by about 50%. So conservation of biodiversity, how can we change human behavior? Protecting endangered species, regulating hunting and fishing. It's not that they can't be done, it's just they need to be done in a level that's in balance with what the environment actually provides. Global warming, there's mixed international response. Greenhouse emissions do not respect national boundaries. So if there is one country that wants to keep their greenhouse emissions low and their neighbor doesn't, it's not going to prevent there from being damage. So all countries have to be on board. Having national parks. This is an example here, Grand Teton National Park. It helps to conserve biodiversity. We can establish wildlife and ecosystem preserves to protect species and ecosystems. We have these biodiversity hotspots. This was a conservation concept developed by Norman Myers in 1988. He identified important areas with high numbers of endemic species for conservation efforts. There's now 34 of these biodiversity hotspots. The preserves perform better with buffer zones. So if it butts directly up against a big city, it's going to do better if it actually has a buffer zone where it can have more natural surroundings around it. We can do more planning for global warming, restoration plans. One example was reintroducing the wolves into Yellowstone. And so they've now done that, and they've been studying that for several years. Dam removal to try and restore some of the rivers. So these are the 34 biodiversity hotspots. So they only cover 2.3% of the Earth's surface, but it does have 42% of the terrestrial vertebrate species and 50% of the world's plants are endemic to those hotspots. So they are areas that you're going to get more bang for your buck in trying to save things. So this picture here shows the gibbon wolf pack in Yellowstone National Park in 2007. So wolves have been identified as a keystone species. So looking at zoos and captive breeding programs are often inefficient and prone to failure. Most species just do not like to breed in captivity. The education efforts do seem to have a positive impact. So while having the animals in the zoo isn't necessarily going to do a lot to get them to breed and bring up numbers, the education does seem to help in making people more aware by letting them actually see the animals. So here's a golden lion tamarin here, living in captivity. And that is the end of this chapter. So there are several other support videos that go along with this information that kind of lets you get to see things in the ecology in a little bit more interesting, interactive way in the video clips.